you all for coming. I'm here today with a really optimistic message about climate change. I feel like mostly we don't hear optimistic messages. There's a tendency to sort of shut down and not want to engage with it. But I have some really good news, which is that food can be really the climate change solution. So first, I'll just explain a little bit about where I'm coming from. So I work on a restaurant called the Perennial. As Gretchen mentioned, I have a background in other restaurants, Mission Chinese and Commonwealth. And in 2012, my husband, who's also my partner, and I had a child. And I feel like it really focused our minds on the future in a new way. And we thought, what if we started a restaurant that was not just retrofitting to be more sustainable, but really putting sustainability at the center of what we do. And so that's what became the Perennial. And we've gotten some good feedback, some awards, and honestly, I'm very proud of what we've done. So we're really thinking about the restaurant as a vehicle for this optimistic message, the message that food can solve climate change, and I will explain that more. This is a little bit more of my background, but I feel like Gretchen really covered it, but I do enjoy the illustrations, and that's the baby I mentioned. So the food system, as it currently stands, is responsible for up to 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the world. The UN did a study, and if you count deforestation, it's really a big contributor. And that was a real wake-up call for me to learn, because I think, like most of us, the sense that the transportation and energy industries were the biggest contributors. And to realize that I was a part of a really big contributor to climate change, made me feel bad and made me wonder, what can I do to improve? And I thought it was going to be things like buying local or changing packaging. But it actually turns out that the biggest impact is how the ingredients are created. So we did a life cycle assessment of Mission Chinese food. And what we found was that the majority of our carbon footprint came from the ingredients, and the majority of that came from beef and lamb. And so we made a change by putting a 25-cent kind of surcharge on beef and lamb items that we use to buy carbon offsets. And that I felt good about in the sense that it kind of sent a signal to the consumer that these items actually have hidden costs. We've externalized those costs for the most part, but to send a signal to say that beef and lamb actually are more impactful, I think has some value and has not really changed the bottom line for us. But then what I learned is, we were wondering as we developed the Perennial, should we serve those ingredients at all? If we were purely vegetarian, we would be limiting our scope. But we wanted to have a big tent that invited everyone in. And we were thinking about meat, in part influenced by Dan Barber's book, The Third Plate, where meat takes a smaller role. And a friend said, you should visit this ranch with this incredible cattle rancher in Marin. And so we did. And he showed us this graph with the point where the plow is invented is really kind of the inflection point for carbon in the atmosphere. And the idea is really just that, like, digging up the soil is releasing CO2 as you till. And then there's another kind of shift where we move into artificial fertilizer and things go up. And of course, at the same time, there's industrialization and like massive infrastructure built around the car. But soil carbon really is a huge carbon sink. The soil on Earth can hold carbon out of the atmosphere back where it came from in the soil. The thing that we learned at that ranch was that if you manage agriculture correctly, you can actually build soil carbon back. So it's one effort is no-till, which is growing plants without tilling them all the time, and using plants that grow from year to year, that you don't need to replant every year, so they're called perennials. And the deep root systems of perennial plants are more effective at drawing down CO2. So almost all of the things that we're growing, like in the prairie states, are annuals, like wheat and corn and soy. But there's a group called the Land Institute in Kansas that has developed a new grain called kernza, which is a relative of wheat, but it has these deep root structures and is actually restoring the soil, pulling down greenhouse gases. So I just want to pause for a second. I mean, I've gotten into the details a bit, but just to say that's amazing, because I feel like we have this kind of mental structure that climate change is just inevitable, that it's just getting worse and worse, and there's nothing we can do except potentially slow it down. And so I really went into that visit to the ranch thinking, like, how can I do less harm? And I came out of it realizing the real question should be, how can I do more good, right? So it's going from a kind of conservation mindset of how do I make less greenhouse gases come into the atmosphere, to a regenerative mindset, how do I draw them back down? So our point of view from that point on was really that the restaurant should be restorative. It should be part of regenerating our atmosphere. We think it's important that it also tastes good because otherwise no one's gonna want it. But one of the things that we've done is, innovate with kernza bread that we bake in-house. And actually, I've been involved in that recipe testing, and it's really exciting to work with a new ingredient that people are just getting to know. And we're trying to build a list of farmers with high soil organic matter, which basically means that they have good soil carbon. So, and we've launched that. It's online at healthysoilguide.com. And then meat, actually, coming back to our original conundrum, can actually be part of it, because animals who are managed in such a way to encourage the native perennial grasses can actually contribute to that soil carbon restoration. So we have been working on being part of a larger movement. We don't want the Perennial to be like the only restaurant doing this, because one restaurant obviously cannot have a huge impact. What we really want is to build a market category. So we've been working with other restaurants to go get carbon neutral, talking to Open Table about a category for sustainable restaurants, and working with regenerative farmers. But I think it's also really important to think about how to get this kind of message into the consumer packaged goods. I know there's a lot of labeling on materials, but it is really important, I think, for people to feel that the choices that they make are supporting their values, are expressions of their values. I think especially for young people. This is sort of to show the way that they're managed in like a tighter formation, and then the fertilizing of the soil is part of regenerating the soil. And if you're interested in more information about ways to address climate change, like in an active, proactive way, I recommend a book called Project Drawdown, which is taken a bunch of scientists and analyzed the different ways that we can actually reverse climate change. The top 25 things that they found, and they've looked at it economically as well, 11 of the top 25 are related to food. And so to me, there's a real opportunity there. Like, at some point, we're gonna have to stop ignoring the problem of climate change and really address it, right? And if you're already there saying like, this is something that's good for the climate, that is, I think, worthwhile. So we have really focused on soil carbon, but there are other, so especially regenerative agriculture and plant-rich diet, and food waste, which I actually didn't touch on much today. But just talking about how the foods that we're eating, the way that they're grown, can have a positive impact on our world. I think it's a real opportunity for CPGs. So we are moving into a world where Americans, by and large, agree that climate change is a problem. I think Americans don't feel that the government is taking charge of the problem. And so are looking for business to offer an alternative future. I think that part of that also is that a consumer demand will go hand in hand with a political demand. So for us at the Perennial, we just celebrated our 2nd anniversary. We had our staff party yesterday, and it felt really good to have this group of people who felt like the work that they're doing in a restaurant, a lot of it is not super fun, like dishes, but to know that it's part of a larger mission, I think it has been really good for our morale. It's certainly been good for me. And then I think for me, there's a question that kind of rings in my mind, which is, if not now, when? If not me, who? And so I invite you to join us in this more regenerative approach to climate change. Thanks.